Mama Amara had exactly one wrapper of ebi and half a bowl of okra soup left in her kitchen when a stranger knocked on her tin door at 11 at night, soaked from the rain, and asked if she had anything at all he could eat. She did not know his name. She did not know that 6 hours earlier he had been sitting in a glass office on the 14th floor of a tower in Victoria Island, staring at a resignation letter from a business partner who had stolen 800 million naira and vanished, wondering if there was a single honest person left in the entire country of Nigeria who would help a stranger for nothing. She gave him the food anyway. All of it. She told him she had already eaten, which was a lie her stomach would punish her for at 3 in the morning. The next day at exactly 9 o'clock, a convoy of 3 black SUVs blocked the narrow street outside her provision stall in Ajegunle, and the same soaked stranger stepped out wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than her house, followed by a line of assistants who all called him one name: Chief. This is the story of Amara Nwosu, a widow who had nothing left to lose and gave the last of it away anyway, and the billionaire who came back the next morning to make sure the whole country knew exactly what kindness had cost her, and exactly what it would give back. My people, before we start, if you have ever given something away when you truly had nothing left, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. This story is for you, and I promise by the end it's going to make you want to call somebody. Let's begin. Chief was 46 years old, and by most measures that mattered in Lagos, he had already won every game worth playing. Ease Continental Holdings controlled shipping terminals in 3 states, a fintech platform used by 9 million Nigerians, and a real estate portfolio that stretched from Lekki to a growing footprint in Accra. He had built it from a single container tracking startup he'd run out of a rented room in Surulere 20 years earlier, and he had built it, he liked to believe, on the specific principle his own late father had drilled into him as a boy selling kerosene by the roadside in Onitsha. A man's word is the only currency that never devalues. That principle had cost him everything 6 hours before he knocked on Amara Nwosu's tin door. His business partner of 14 years, a man named Obinna Falana who Chief had once considered closer than a brother, had spent the better part of 18 months quietly siphoning company funds through a web of shell logistics contracts, funneling the money into an offshore account in the Caymans, and boarding a private flight to Dubai the moment his internal auditors flagged the discrepancy. 800 million naira gone, along with 14 years of trust Chief had never once thought to question. He had sat in his own boardroom that afternoon, surrounded by lawyers and forensic accountants delivering the details of the betrayal in the flat, careful tones professionals use when they're navigating someone else's devastation, and felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the money at all. If Obinna could do this, a man who had eaten at his mother's table, who had stood beside him at his own father's funeral, who had known him since they were both 19 years old and broke, then what exactly was the value of trust in this country anymore? What was the value of kindness, of loyalty, of the specific, careful decency his father had insisted mattered more than wealth, if the person you trusted most could still, given enough time and enough opportunity, decide you were simply a resource to be emptied? He did not go home that night. He drove instead, aimlessly, through Lagos traffic that thinned as the evening rain began, until he found himself somewhere in Ajegunle he did not recognize, his phone dead, his driver dismissed hours earlier, his expensive shoes soaked through from walking the last kilometer after his car's tire blew on a pothole nobody had bothered to fix. He had 800 naira in his pocket, no working phone, no umbrella, and a hunger that had been building since he'd skipped lunch during the crisis meeting, and as the rain grew heavier, he found himself standing outside a small provision shop with its tin door propped half open, a single kerosene lamp glowing inside, and the unmistakable smell of okra soup drifting into the wet night air. He knocked, not entirely sure why he hadn't simply kept walking toward whatever hotel his 800 naira might afford. Amara Nwosu was 58 years old, and she had buried her husband Emeka 9 years earlier when a stroke took him in his sleep on a Tuesday night that had started like every other Tuesday night of their 31-year marriage. She had raised 3 children on the modest income from her provision stall, sent all 3 through secondary school, watched 2 of them move to Abuja and Port Harcourt for work that kept them too busy to visit more than twice a year, and was now raising her grandson Kelechi, a serious, quiet boy of 11 whose mother, her youngest daughter, had died of complications during childbirth, and whose father had disappeared before the child was 6 months old. That particular evening had been harder than most. The rain had kept customers away from her stall for 2 straight days. Her small savings had gone entirely toward Kelechi's outstanding school fees that morning, and by the time she locked up her shop and walked the short distance to the single room she shared with her grandson, she had exactly 1 wrapper of EBA and half a bowl of okra soup left to her name, enough for one modest meal, which she had been planning to give entirely to Kelechi, while she went to bed on tea and the memory of better days. When the knock came at 11 that night, her first instinct, honed by 20 years of running a small business in a neighborhood where opportunists were not unheard of, was caution. She peered through the gap in her tin door and saw a man soaked to the bone, his expensive-looking shirt clinging to him, his shoes ruined, his eyes carrying the particular hollow exhaustion of someone who had lost something significant that day. "Please, madam," he said, his voice carrying an accent from somewhere near Onitsha, careful and formal despite his obvious distress. "I do not mean to disturb you. I only wanted to ask if there is anywhere nearby I could buy something small to eat. I have not eaten since morning." Amara studied him for a long moment through the gap in the door, the particular assessment of a woman who had learned to read desperation from genuine danger through decades of running a business alone in a neighborhood that did not always distinguish kindly between the two. What she saw was not danger. What she saw was a man too tired and too wet to perform anything other than exactly what he was: hungry, lost, and ashamed to be asking a stranger for help. "There is nowhere open at this hour," she said, opening the door fully. "But come inside from the rain. I have small food. Not much, but you are welcome to it." Chibik hesitated at the threshold, the specific hesitation of a man unaccustomed, after decades of wealth, to accepting anything from someone who so clearly had less than he did. "Madam, I do not want to take your food. I can find something else. There is nothing else at this hour in this area, and a man cannot sleep hungry in this rain," Amara said, already moving toward her small kerosene stove where the modest pot of okra soup sat covered against the evening's damp. "Sit down. It is not much, but it is warm." She served him the entire portion, the full wrapper of ibia, the complete half bowl of soup, watching him eat with the careful, grateful slowness of a man who had genuinely not realized how hungry he was until food was placed in front of him. "You are not eating, madam," Chibik observed partway through the meal, noticing she had prepared nothing for herself. "I already ate before you came," Amara said easily, the practiced lie of a woman accustomed to putting others first without drawing attention to the cost of doing so. He believed her, or told himself he believed her, though something in the careful way she avoided his eyes as she said it left a small, uncomfortable doubt he could not quite shake even as exhaustion pulled him toward sleep on the low bench she offered him for the night, insisting he could not walk back into the rain in his condition. Kelechi, woken by the unfamiliar voice, peered sleepily from behind the curtain that separated the room's sleeping area, and Amara gently ushered him back to bed, murmuring reassurance about a traveler who needed shelter from the storm, the ordinary, unremarkable kindness of a household that had clearly extended exactly this kind of hospitality before, to travelers, to neighbors in crisis, to anyone the night brought to their door in genuine need. Chibik lay awake on the narrow bench long after the household had settled into sleep, listening to the rain finally easing outside, turning over in his mind the particular quality of the evening's kindness, offered without hesitation, without calculation, without the careful cost-benefit assessment he had watched grown men in boardrooms perform over stakes far smaller than a stranger's single meal. At some point past 3 in the morning, needing water, he rose quietly and found the small kitchen area. And it was there, searching for a cup in the dim moonlight through the single window, that he found the truth Amara had hidden from him. An empty pot. No food remaining anywhere in the modest kitchen. Not a single scrap set aside for herself. She had given him everything she had, and gone to bed with nothing, and had lied about it specifically so he would not feel the weight of what he was taking. He stood in that small kitchen for a long time, the specific ache of understanding settling into his chest, the recognition that he had spent the entire devastating day mourning the betrayal of a man who had everything and still wanted more, while 3 feet away slept a woman who had almost nothing and had given away the last of it without a moment's hesitation. He left before dawn, careful not to wake the household, but not before he found a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil in his soaked trouser pocket and wrote a brief note, thanking Amara for her kindness, promising he would find a way to repay it, signed simply with the initial C, because giving his full name at that hour in that state felt like it would somehow cheapen what she had offered him with no expectation of anything in return. What Amara did not know, folding that small note into her apron pocket the next morning with a fond, faintly amused smile at the earnestness of the exhausted stranger who had clearly been embarrassed by his own need, was that the man who had eaten her last meal was already, by 7 that morning, back inside his own world, calling his chief of staff with instructions that would arrive at her tin door within 2 hours. I need everything you can find on a provisions trader named Amara Nwosu, operating a stall in Ajegunle, Chibik told his assistant, Ifeoma, a sharp, efficient woman who had learned over 6 years not to question her employer's occasionally unusual instructions. And I need it within the hour. Then I need the full convoy ready. We're going back there properly this time. Ifeoma, accustomed to her employer's sudden philanthropic impulses, but unaccustomed to the particular intensity in his voice that morning, moved quickly. Within 40 minutes, she had confirmed Amara's identity, her modest business registration, the outstanding balance on her grandson's school fees she had paid in full just the previous morning, the small loan she carried from a local cooperative that consumed nearly a third of her monthly income in repayments, and the quiet, unremarkable dignity of a widow who had, according to 3 separate neighbors Ifeoma discreetly interviewed, never once turned away a genuinely hungry person from her door. In over a decade of running that small shop, regardless of her own circumstances that week. At 9 o'clock that morning, the same street that had seen Chibik stumble through in soaked ruin the night before now watched 3 black SUVs navigate carefully around the potholes, drawing the immediate, curious attention of every shopkeeper and passerby within view. Amara was arranging her modest stock of provisions when the convoy stopped directly outside her stall, and she watched, bewildered, as a line of assistants emerged first, followed by a man in an impeccable charcoal suit whose face, once she registered it fully beneath the transformation of clean, dry, expensive clothing, made her hand freeze mid-motion over a stack of tinned tomatoes. "You," she said softly, disbelief coloring her voice. "You are the man from last night." "I am, madam," Chibik said, and though he now stood before her surrounded by the unmistakable trappings of enormous wealth, his voice carried the same careful, formal respect it had held the previous evening, soaked and hungry at her door. "My name is Chibik Ease. I am the chief executive of Ease Continental Holdings. I did not give you my full name last night because I did not want it to change how you treated a hungry stranger. I wanted to know, for reasons that matter more than I can easily explain, whether a person would still help me when they believed I had absolutely nothing to offer them in return." A small crowd had begun gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by the convoy and the growing recognition, among several onlookers, of exactly whose face and name they were witnessing in the flesh. Amara's hand had not moved from the stack of tinned tomatoes. "You are Ease. The Ease from the television. From the shipping company." "I am," Chibik confirmed. "And you, madam, gave the last food in your house to a stranger last night, and then lied to that stranger's face about having already eaten so he would not feel guilty for taking it. I found the empty pot at 3 in the morning. I know what you gave me, and I know exactly what it cost you." Amara's composure, carefully maintained through decades of dignified, quiet endurance, finally cracked slightly at that specific detail, the realization that her small private lie had been discovered and understood for exactly the sacrifice it represented. "It was only food, sir. Anybody would have done the same for a hungry stranger in the rain." "That is not true, madam," Chibik said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity that carried clearly to the gathered crowd. "I have spent this entire week discovering exactly how untrue that is. I lost 800 million naira yesterday to a business partner of 14 years who decided, after everything I had given him, that stealing from me was easier than continuing to earn what he already had. I walked through this neighborhood last night specifically because I needed to know if there was still a single person in this country who would help someone with genuinely nothing to gain from it. I found her. She is standing right in front of me, and I intend to make sure the entire country understands exactly what her kindness looks like." The crowd, now considerably larger, had gone almost entirely silent, absorbing the specific weight of what was unfolding on an ordinary Tuesday morning outside a modest provisions stall. "Sir, I do not need anything," Amara said, though her voice carried a slight tremor now, the particular disorientation of a woman whose quiet acts of decency had never before been witnessed, let alone publicly acknowledged, by anyone beyond her own small household. "I did what anybody with a heart would do." "Perhaps," Chibik said gently, But you are the one who actually did it, madam, when you had almost nothing left, when your grandson's school fees had emptied your savings just the previous morning, when you yourself had not eaten. I know all of this now. I have spent the last 2 hours learning exactly who you are. And I would be lying to you exactly as I once lied about my own name if I pretended I intended to simply thank you and walk away. He gestured to Ifeoma, who stepped forward with a leather folio, and what followed, delivered with the same careful, deliberate formality Chibik had carried since the previous night, transformed the modest street corner into something the neighborhood would discuss for years afterward. He had, in the 2 hours since leaving her tin door that morning, established a trust fund covering Kelechi's complete education through university, arranged for Amara's outstanding cooperative loan to be paid in full, and purchased, through a private transaction completed within the hour, the small building that housed her provisions stall, transferring ownership entirely into her name so that no landlord could ever again hold the roof over her business as leverage against her. "This is too much, sir," Amara said, her voice now openly unsteady, the accumulated weight of 9 years of careful, exhausting survival finally meeting a moment too large to absorb with her usual composed dignity. "I only gave you food. A simple meal. You gave me proof, madam, that the country I grew up believing in still exists," Chibik said. "That is worth considerably more to me this week than 800 million naira, and I intend to treat it accordingly." The story, inevitably, spread within hours, first through the immediate neighborhood, then through a video one bystander had recorded on their phone that found its way onto social media by that afternoon, and by evening, national news outlets were running segments on the billionaire CEO who had spent a rain-soaked night incognito, only to discover the exact kind of unguarded decency, his own devastating business betrayal, had made him fear no longer existed. What the news segments captured in the days that followed was not merely the transformation of Amara Nwosu's material circumstances, though that transformation was substantial and lasting, but the quieter, more complicated relationship that developed between Chibik and the widow whose small kindness had arrived at the exact moment he most needed proof that trust remained worth extending. He visited her stall 3 times over the following month, not with cameras or convoys, but quietly in a plain car, sitting on the same low bench where he'd slept that first rainy night, drinking tea she insisted on preparing despite his protests that she had already given him more than enough. "You did not have to keep coming back, sir," Amara told him during one such visit, watching Kelechi do his homework at the small table nearby, the boy's careful, serious concentration, a habit Chibik had come to recognize and quietly admire over these visits. "I think I did, madam," Chibik said. "For 14 years I trusted a man who took everything I offered him and decided it still wasn't enough. I have spent every day since discovering him more suspicious than I have ever been in my life, wondering what everyone around me actually wants from me. Coming here, sitting with you and Kelechi, drinking tea that has nothing to do with contracts or boardrooms, it reminds me that suspicion is not the same thing as wisdom. Some people simply are who they appear to be. You taught me that on a night I badly needed the lesson." Kelechi, listening more closely than his careful concentration on his homework suggested, looked up at that. "Grandma says the same thing about you, sir. She says you did not have to come back and check on us either, but you keep doing it anyway, and that tells her something true about your heart." Chibik had not expected the boy's observation to affect him quite as deeply as it did. The particular, unguarded honesty children carry before the world teaches them the same careful calculation adults eventually learn. Over the following year, the relationship deepened into something the neighborhood came to understand as genuine rather than performative. A wealthy man who had found in a widow's tin-roofed shop something his considerable resources had never quite provided, a household where his presence was valued for exactly who he was rather than what he could offer. Chibik funded, through the Amara Nwosu Community Trust, he established that same year, not merely his own gratitude to one woman, but a broader initiative providing microloans to small traders across Ajegunle and similar neighborhoods across Lagos, structured deliberately with lower interest rates and longer repayment windows than the predatory cooperative arrangements that had once consumed a third of Amara's modest income. He hired Kelechi's eventual tutors himself, quietly, insisting the boy's natural intelligence, evident even at 11 years old in his careful, methodical approach to his schoolwork, deserved resources that pure circumstance had never before made available to him. And Obinna Falana, the business partner whose betrayal had sent Chibik wandering through Ajegunle's rain-soaked streets that fateful night, was eventually located in Dubai 18 months later through a coordinated effort between Chibik's legal team and Nigerian financial crimes investigators, extradited and prosecuted for the 800 million naira fraud, a resolution that brought Chibik a measured satisfaction considerably quieter than the devastation the betrayal had originally caused him. I used to think that money was the thing worth protecting most carefully, Chibik told Amara 3 years after that first rainy night, sitting once again on the same low bench in her now renovated shop, a modest but meaningful upgrade the trust had funded alongside the neighborhood's broader improvements. Obinna taught me how quickly it can disappear, no matter how carefully you guard it. You taught me something considerably more valuable that same week. That there is a kind of wealth that cannot be stolen, because it was never about accumulation in the first place. It was always about what you're willing to give away when you have nothing left to spare. Amara, older now, though carrying herself with the particular ease of a woman whose most difficult years had finally genuinely passed, smiled at that with the same quiet dignity she'd carried since the night she opened her tin door to a soaked, hungry stranger. I only gave you food, sir. You have given my grandson a future I could never have provided alone. I think, between the two of us, I still received the better bargain. I disagree, madam, Chibik said, watching through the shop's window as Kelechi, now 14 and considerably taller, walked home from the improved secondary school the trust had helped modernize, his school bag full of books that would, within a handful of years, carry him toward a university education neither Amara nor Chibik, on that rain-soaked night 3 years earlier, could have confidently predicted. I think what you gave me that night was the last, best proof I needed that decency still exists in this world without needing to be paid for in advance. I have spent every day since trying to make sure that proof was worth what it cost you. Kelechi entered the shop moments later, greeting them both with the easy familiarity of 3 years of regular visits, and settled into his usual spot at the small table to begin his homework, a household rhythm that had become, for all three of them, considerably more meaningful than the wealth or circumstance that had originally brought them together. If you have ever given away the last of what you had to someone who needed it more, even when you weren't certain where your own next meal was coming from, I hope this story reminds you that kindness offered without calculation has a way of finding its way back to you, sometimes in forms far larger than you could have ever imagined asking for. If this story touched your heart tonight, please like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it. And let me know in the comments, who is the person in your life who gave you something when they truly had nothing left to spare? Tell me their name. I read every single comment, and I promise you somebody watching tonight needs to be reminded to say thank you to exactly that person before another day passes. Until next time, my people, be the kind of person who opens the door in the rain. You never know whose whole world you might change, and you never know whose kindness is quietly waiting to change yours in return. Good night and thank you for watching.